The arrival. The records that survived say very little. A name, a date, the faint outline of a life that never fit into the order of medicine or the faith of men. But some stories don't live in ink. They fester in silence, in the memory of rooms that no longer stand, in the dust of foundations laid over ground that was never clean. In 1847, in the frost-bitten quiet of Massachusetts, a woman named Latoya was carried into the Blessed Mercy Infirmary. 37 days later, the building itself seemed to breathe differently. The doctors who treated her stopped speaking her name, and some of them, those who tried hardest to explain what happened, never practiced again. What you're about to hear is not a fable, not a witch trial passed down through folklore, not a moral tale scribbled by a minister in need of fire and brimstone. It is a case. A medical file so unsettling that the men of science who documented it burned their own notes rather than allow anyone else to read them. Only one journal survived, tucked away in an attic, hidden like a sin. And it is from those pages, cracked and yellowed with age, that we return to Millbrook, Massachusetts, the town that tried to forget the woman who refused to stay forgotten. Millbrook. In winter, the town of Millbrook lay 15 miles northwest of Salem, though by 1847 its residents bristled if anyone mentioned that cursed name. The witch trials had ended a century and a half earlier, but the shame lingered. The townspeople were eager to be known for their textile mills, their church steeples, their Protestant order, not for superstition. But if Salem had been consumed by hysteria in the 1600s, Millbrook in the 1800s was consumed by division. The Congregationalist families who founded the settlement guarded their place like hawks. Their names were etched into the stones of the cemetery, into the walls of the churches, into the very soil. And then came the immigrants, the Irish Catholics who labored in the mills along the Mary River, their voices rising in strange hymns. At dusk, their prayers marked with gestures the old families called heathen. Tension sat like frost on every window pane, invisible but biting. At the heart of this divide stood the Blessed Mercy Infirmary. A 3-story brick monolith with narrow windows and a sharp roof, it was less hospital than citadel. Founded in 1834 by Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore, its mission was not merely to heal bodies but to purify souls. Whitmore preached that sickness was as much spiritual as it was physical, that the sins of a man's ancestors could poison his blood as surely as infection. Patients were prayed over before they were examined. Scripture read before treatment was prescribed. For the poor, it was often the only refuge. For the town's Protestant elite, it was a statement of moral authority. And it was into this place, into its corridors, that smelled of coal smoke and carbolic acid, that Latoya arrived on January 15, 1847. The foundling. The snow had been falling for 3 days when Silas Hartwell, a farmer, discovered her. She was curled in his barn beneath the broken beams of the hayloft, wearing nothing but a thin cotton dress, her lips blue, but her body strangely unmarked by frost. Her skin was olive-toned, her hair long and dark. When she opened her eyes, they gleamed too sharply for a woman half dead from exposure. She gave her name as Latoya, nothing more. When Silas asked where she had come from, she whispered that she didn't know. She carried a small leather pouch of 7 silver coins and a brass locket without inscription, nothing else, not even shoes. By dawn, she had been carried by horse-drawn carriage to Blessed Mercy. The townsfolk whispered already. Was she a runaway, a mad woman, an orphan abandoned by Irish kin? Reverend Whitmore himself watched from the infirmary steps as the carriage pulled up. His hands trembled as he crossed himself, though he did not admit it. Something in her eyes unnerved him. Dr. Jonathan Aldrich, the chief physician of Blessed Mercy, was Dr. Jonathan Aldrich, a man of 34 with a face carved in precise lines, like someone had measured where to put his frown. He had studied under Dr. Samuel Woodward, one of the nation's first alienists, specialists in the diseases of the mind. Aldrich believed in order, in categories, in charting every human behavior until it fit a pattern. But Latoya refused categories. Her vitals were normal. No frostbite, no infection, no malnourishment. Her reflexes were quick. Her memory, at least when she spoke, was exact. Yet she carried herself as though she were merely visiting, not admitted. She did not fidget or plead or pray like the other patients. She watched. Every detail of the ward, every gesture of the doctors she absorbed with a calm intensity that unsettled even Aldrich's clinical detachment. When asked her religious background, her body convulsed. She trembled, her breath shallow, and then she whispered, not in English, not in Latin, but in a language Dr. Marcus Brennan, the youngest physician on staff and a scholar of ancient tongues, admitted he could not identify. It is not Latin, Brennan wrote in his first notes, nor Greek. It contains African cadence, perhaps Caribbean inflection, but structured like neither. She speaks as if reciting, yet denies knowledge of any language but English. The first night. The nurses later said it began that very night. Sister Mary Catherine, one of the Sacred Heart nuns permitted to serve at Blessed Mercy, noted in her log that Latoya anticipated the rhythms of the hospital as though time bent toward her. She sat upright in her bed moments before the night watchman's steps echoed down the hall. She requested water exactly as the well was drawn. She stirred from sleep just before the chapel bells tolled. Patients began to murmur of dreams. One woman recovering from pneumonia swore that Latoya spoke to her in the night, describing in detail the death of her husband 5 years earlier, details the woman had never shared. Latoya denied it, but the woman insisted. On the third night, Dr. Aldrich himself witnessed it. Latoya sat upright, her eyes closed, and spoke in that unknown tongue. Her voice filled the ward like a hymn from beneath the floorboards. The patients stirred in their beds, restless, murmuring. One man later wept openly, claiming he had seen visions of a jungle, of fire-lit rituals, of voices chanting from the earth itself. Aldrich's journal entry for that night is one of the few that survived. The patient does not fit the categories of hysteria or melancholia. She influences others by means unaccounted for by medical science. I struggle between my oath as physician and the creeping suspicion that we confront something beyond comprehension. The change in the infirmary's strange patterns followed Latoya. The infirmary's furnaces, which had failed all winter, began to heat the building evenly. The rats, long a plague, seemed to vanish from the wards. The sick improved more quickly, when near her, though some declined with alarming speed. Order bent around her, as though she were the axis upon which the hospital spun. Reverend Whitmore, visiting as always to provide prayer, demanded to meet with her in the chapel. Witnesses later described him emerging pale, clutching his Bible so tightly his knuckles shone. That woman, he whispered to Dr. Aldrich, possesses knowledge no Christian should carry. God help us if we do not act. What he meant? No, one knew. He would not say. But within days the hospital itself seemed to turn restless as if walls could remember. Doors rattled, lamps flickered, and the patients, their dreams began to merge. Shared visions, shared voices. It was only the beginning. On the morning of January 21st, a nurse ran screaming from Latoya's room. She swore she had entered quietly, carrying a tray only to find the young woman standing barefoot in the center of the floor, eyes closed, whispering in her unknown language. But it was not her words that sent the nurse fleeing. Every patient in the ward, every last one, was whispering the exact same words, in perfect unison, though none of them spoke the language. And when Dr. Aldrich burst in moments later, he found Latoya staring at him with eyes that seemed older than the town itself. "You've built this house," she whispered in perfect English, "on the bones of the forgotten." Then she smiled, and every lamp in the infirmary went out at once. The darkness in the wards. When the lamps of the Blessed Mercy Infirmary extinguished in perfect unison that January morning, the silence that followed was not the silence of an empty building. It was the silence of something listening. Patients wailed, nurses stumbled in the dark, and physicians barked orders that seemed small against the sudden abyss. Dr. Jonathan Aldrich struck a match with steady hands, though his heart raced. The sulfur burned sharp in his nose. In the trembling light, he saw Latoya still standing barefoot in the center of her room, her face calm, her dark eyes locked onto him, as though he were the only soul in the world. "You will find them," she said softly, "but you will not like what you uncover." The match sputtered out, and in that brief pitch black before the nurse relit a lantern, Aldrich swore he felt the brush of unseen fingers across his sleeve, like a hand reaching out from centuries past. The fractured staff by the next day, whispers coursed through the hospital faster than fever. Some claimed Latoya had cursed the lamps. Others said her words had struck too close to truth. Dr. Aldrich attempted order. He gathered the 7 physicians in his study, the fire crackling in the grate, journals piled like fortifications around him. His methodical voice laid out the facts. The patient exhibited no physical illness. Her episodes aligned with heightened agitation among other patients. Shared dreams and synchronized speech suggested collective hysteria, not supernatural cause. But the room did not accept his reason. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the hospital's eldest physician with hands knotted by age, leaned forward. "Jonathan, you saw it. We all heard them speaking in her tongue. Explain that with your Harvard learning." Young Dr. Marcus Brennan, pale but restless, interjected. "The tongue itself. I've begun cross-referencing maritime records. There are whispers of dialects from the West Indies, fragments carried by ships, fragments lost in translation. She speaks fluently, but the dialect may not even belong to one culture. It's, stitched together, a quilt of tongues." "A quilt of demons, you mean?" Dr. Hartwell muttered. Tension splintered the staff. Brennan insisted Latoya was the key to some ancient linguistic puzzle. Hartwell argued she was possessed. Aldrich tried to keep them tethered to observation, but he saw it already. The hospital was dividing into believers and skeptics, and neither camp could stop watching the woman in the white bed who seemed to bend their reality. The patient's dreams. The first to break was Mrs. Zelena Hitchcock, the pneumonia widow who swore Latoya whispered of her husband. On the 7th, night after Latoya's arrival, she began to dream with such precision that nurses recorded her words. "She says the stones remember," Mrs. Hitchcock murmured in her sleep. "The river remembers too, the chains, the cries, all buried, but the ground knows. She tells me names, but they are not mine to carry." When pressed in daylight, Mrs. Hitchcock wept. "It is not only my Samuel. She shows me men, in chains I never knew, children who died nameless. I feel their breath in mine. I wake gasping not from sickness but from grief I cannot claim." Other patients soon followed. A merchant dreamed of fires on shores he had never visited. A mill worker's daughter described the cracking of whips though she had never left Massachusetts. A boy recovering from fever woke screaming in a language his parents did not recognize. But Latoya seemed to understand. It was as though the hospital had become an archive of sorrows, too heavy for 1 century alone. The Reverend's warning. Reverend Whitmore returned, flanked now by 2 fellow ministers. His voice was tight with fear, though he cloaked it in scripture. "This woman," he told Aldrich in private, "has turned your infirmary into a theater for spirits. Do not be deceived. She does not heal, she corrupts. If patients improve, it is the devil's counterfeit. If they worsen, it is his truth." Aldrich clenched his jaw. "Reverend, I treat bodies. What I see is not corruption but pattern. Some are drawn to her and recover. Others recoil and decline. That is influence, not sorcery." But Whitmore's hands trembled as he pressed his Bible against Aldrich's chest. "Then ask yourself, Doctor, why does she know the bones beneath this hospital? Why does she speak of things you and I never told her?" Aldrich did not answer. He could not. Because in the sleepless hours of the night, when he returned to his journals, he found his own handwriting wavering. He too was beginning to remember things he could not possibly know. The journal of Dr. Brennan. It was Brennan who unearthed the first tangible link. 1 week after the blackout, he came to Aldrich's office with a bundle of papers trembling in his hands. "I went to Salem," he confessed. "To the Historical Society. I found records of a shipwreck, the Esperanza, 1823. A slaver, though Massachusetts had outlawed such traffic by then. Among the rescued was a girl, 4 years old. Name, Latoya. Aldrich froze. The family who took her in reported she disappeared 3 years later. They said she left a note in some gibberish no one could read. And now here she is, 24 years old if she is that girl. But Jonathan, she doesn't look 24. She looks no older than 20. He laid the papers down. Ink blurred, with age, but the name glimmered like a coal. Latoya. Aldrich's mouth dried. Coincidence, perhaps, or continuity too terrible to ignore. He dismissed Brennan with clinical calm, but when the door closed, he whispered aloud to the empty study. "What are you?" The first experiment driven by both dread and obsession, Aldrich conducted his first true test. He arranged for Latoya to sit with an elderly farmer, Jeremiah Couch, whose lungs rattled with each breath. He observed from behind a partition, Quill, poised. At first, Latoya said nothing. She simply held the man's hand. Minutes passed. Then Mr. Couch began to speak, not of his cough, but of the war of 1812, of friends lost, of fear he had never confessed. His voice cracked, but with each confession his breath eased. By the end, he inhaled deeply for the first time in months, tears in his eyes. "It's lighter," he whispered. "The weight's gone." Aldrich's quill shook. He wanted to write. Improvement due to catharsis. He wanted to chart it, categorize it, bind it to science. But beneath the words, something gnawed. She had drawn the sickness from him not by medicine, but by memory. The child with the voices, the case that sealed the hospital's division, came days later. A boy of 12, Timothy Wadsworth, was admitted for fits of madness. His parents swore he spoke in voices not his own, recounting histories he had never learned. Ministers had declared him possessed. Physicians called it mania. Aldrich introduced him to Latoya. What followed unsettled even the most skeptical. The boy's fits ceased instantly in her presence. He looked at her with recognition, though they had never met, and began to speak in her same strange language. For nearly an hour they conversed, fluid and steady, their voices rising and falling like echoes of an older world. When it ended, Timothy slumped into her arms, calm, almost smiling. Days later, he was discharged, never to suffer his fits again, but the ministers left pale and shaken. "She consorts with familiar spirits," Reverend Marsh whispered. "Mark my words. She binds with demons." Aldrich recorded none of their words, only his trembling observation. Her presence restores where our science fails, yet the price is knowledge that unravels the mind. The seeds of doubt nurses began avoiding her wing at night. Some claimed to hear voices in the walls, some swore the air thickened when she prayed in her unknown tongue. Yet others lingered, drawn as if to warmth. Dr. Hartwell grew gaunt, muttering scripture, his faith eroding. Brennan grew feverish in his research, haunting libraries and archives, returning with scraps of connections between Latoya and forgotten shipwrecks. Even Aldrich, who prided himself on logic, began to feel his grip slip. He remembered dreams, not his own, visions of chains, of forests under moonlight, of rituals where fire cracked like living breath. He wrote by candlelight. "I am losing my detachment. I remember things I never lived. She infects us not with illness, but with history." The hidden journals. It was in the hospital's basement, amid dust and damp stone, that Aldrich found the oldest records. Crates left from the infirmary's founding, ledgers, sermons, patient logs, and within them a leather-bound journal stamped N. Blackwood, M.D. He read until his hands trembled. Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood, physician before Aldrich's time, had experimented on patients, slaves, natives, immigrants. He sought to break what he called heathen memory, convinced that ancestral knowledge was a defect to be excised. His methods: confinement, deprivation, cruelty. And one entry chilled Aldrich most. "The young woman brought from the woods resists all treatment. She remembers too much. I fear she is not merely patient, but vessel. If she cannot be cured, she must be contained. The date, 1838. The description, unmistakably, Latoya. Aldrich dropped the book as if it burned. For if Blackwood had confined her 10 years prior, how could she stand before them now, ageless, unchanged? That night Aldrich confronted Latoya in her room. "You've been here before," he whispered. "In these halls, under Blackwood's hand." Latoya's dark eyes lifted from her locket. She smiled faintly. "You're beginning to remember." "Remember what?" His voice cracked. She leaned close, her breath warm against his ear. "That the sins of the fathers are carved into the bones of the children. And you, doctor, carry more than you know." Aldrich staggered back, his chest tight. For a moment, just a moment, he swore he saw her face ripple, shifting into dozens of faces at once. Men, women, children, black, white, native, chained, free. 1,000 eyes staring through her. And then the lamps went out again. But this time, they did not return. The night without lamps. For 3 nights after the second blackout, Blessed Mercy lay in uneasy half-light. Lanterns burned but sputtered. Oil lamps flickered no matter how much. They were cleaned or refilled. Candles melted twice as quickly. As if unseen breath bent the flames. The patients whispered of shadows that moved independent of their bodies. A nurse swore she saw her own reflection in the window blink when she did not. And in the hallways, where the crucifixes hung, the air thickened until every breath dragged like syrup. Dr. Jonathan Aldrich told himself these were delusions bred of exhaustion. Yet when he pressed his quill to the journal page, his hand would not write hallucination. His hand wrote witnessed, and he hated himself for not crossing it out. The minister's ultimatum on the morning of February 1st, 3 ministers convened in Aldrich's office. Reverend Whitmore's face looked hollow, cheeks sunken as though he had aged 10 years in a fortnight. Beside him stood Reverend Blackwood, son of the very physician whose journals Aldrich had uncovered, and Reverend Marsh of the Methodists, his Bible clutched so tightly the leather creaked. "You will allow us to perform an exorcism?" Whitmore demanded, his voice fraying. "If you do not, this hospital will collapse into damnation." Aldrich sat stiffly, the journal of Nehemiah Blackwood hidden in his desk drawer. "She is not possessed. She is—" He faltered. "Ill, perhaps, or gifted in ways we do not understand, but not possessed." Reverend Blackwood slammed his palm on the desk. "Do not say gifted. She is the same woman my father wrote of. The same face that haunted him until he took his own life. If you believe she is no demon, then tell me, why has she not aged? Why do the patients echo her tongue? Why do I dream of chains every night, though I have never seen them?" The room went quiet. Even Whitmore dared not interrupt. Aldrich steadied his voice. "You may observe her. You may record what you see. But no rituals. Not yet. I will not have this infirmary become theater for fear." The ministers exchanged glances heavy with mistrust. Whitmore spoke last. "Then, doctor, her damnation will become yours." Shared madness by the second week of February. The line between patient and staff blurred. Nurse Margaret Thornton reported dreams of Millbrook's founding in 1692, though she had never studied the town's history. She described settlers cutting down pine trees and burying bodies hastily when fever swept through. The details she recited matched records in the county archives, records she could not possibly know. Dr. Samuel Hartwell confessed privately to Aldrich that he now heard voices of patients who had died decades earlier. "They call me by name, Jonathan. They remind me of prescriptions I never filled, of failures I tried to forget, and they do not forgive me." Even Aldrich himself began to slip. In the dead hours of night, he saw the infirmary walls breathe, inhaling and exhaling like the chest of a great sleeper. When he pressed his ear to the floorboards, he swore he heard a pulse, deep and rhythmic, as if the hospital itself had veins. He wrote, "The institution is no longer building. It is vessel. Latoya in the chapel at." Reverend Whitmore's insistence, Latoya was brought to the chapel for observation. She entered barefoot, a simple white dress brushing the stone floor. The ministers arrayed themselves as if to guard against her, Bibles, crosses, and whispered prayer. But Latoya ignored them. She walked to the altar, placed her hand on the wood, and closed her eyes. The chapel's air shifted, warmer, yet unbearably heavy. Parishioners who had gathered for the trial experiment gasped, some falling to their knees as tears spilled without reason. "She is making us feel," Marsh muttered, trembling. Latoya spoke then, not in her strange tongue, but in perfect English. "This ground remembers more than you wish to admit." The ministers flinched. "You buried the indigenous here, the Pennacook who tended these woods before your fathers took them. You buried slaves here too, runaways who died in chains under your watch. You buried them without names. But names cannot stay buried. They rise." As she spoke, the rafters groaned as though the building itself strained to contain her words. Mrs. Hitchcock, the pneumonia widow, began sobbing uncontrollably. "I hear them," she cried. "I hear their names." Latoya turned her head, eyes meeting Aldrich's. "And so do you." The boy returned Timothy Wadsworth, the boy whose madness had ceased in Latoya's presence, returned to the hospital with his parents, not as patient, but as witness. His parents claimed he still spoke in strange voices at night, but always with calm, always with knowledge beyond him. During one chapel gathering, Timothy stood abruptly and began speaking in Latoya's tongue. She replied without hesitation. The exchange lasted minutes, incomprehensible to all others, yet deeply unsettling. When it ended, Timothy turned to the ministers. "You built your houses on bones," he said in a voice that was not his own. "You prayed to your God while you forgot the others. But they did not forget you." His parents fainted. Reverend Whitmore screamed the word demon, but Aldrich felt his skin crawl with a different truth. The boy was not possessed. He was remembering. The bones beneath it was Mrs. Hitchcock, fading with pneumonia, who revealed the final piece. She begged Aldrich to listen privately, her breath shallow. "She told me where the bones are," she whispered, "under this very floor. She said the first stones of this infirmary crushed the sacred burial ground. She said the earth has been crying out ever since." Her eyes glazed with fever, but her hand clutched his tightly. "Doctor," she said, "there is more. Records of cruelty. A physician who experimented not just on her but on others. She said it was all written down." Aldrich thought of the journals of Nehemiah Blackwood. "She said," Mrs. Hitchcock rasped, "that the hospital cannot heal until the truth is spoken, until the bones are honored. Promise me you'll speak it." Hours later, Mrs. Hitchcock died, but her face was calm, almost radiant, as if Latoya had lifted the weight from her at last. The minister's breaking point misses. Hitchcock's death fractured the fragile truce. Reverend Blackwood accused Latoya of stealing the woman's soul. Reverend Marsh demanded immediate exorcism. Whitmore, trembling, declared the infirmary cursed and threatened to close it. But Aldrich stood against them. "You will not touch her. Not while I draw breath. She is no demon. She is the wound speaking. And if we silence her, we silence the truth of what was done here." His voice shook with fury. For the first time, the ministers fell quiet, seeing in Aldrich not just a physician but a man possessed by conviction. Yet conviction is not immunity. That night, Aldrich dreamed he was not himself but another man, hands slick with blood, scalpels, digging into flesh, a patient's screams echoing in the infirmary cellar. When he awoke, his own hands ached as if they had held the scalpel. The ascent of the dead by mid-February, the entire hospital shared the sickness of memory. Patients wandered halls, murmuring in languages they had never known. Nurses wept without cause, clutching their crucifixes until marks bruised their skin. And then came the night when every patient in Latoya's wing rose from their beds simultaneously. Eyes closed, voices chanting in unison. The staff rushed in terror, but the patients did not move toward violence. They walked slowly, reverently toward the chapel, where Latoya already stood waiting. She raised her hand and silence fell. "They remember," she said. "Through us, they remember." Her words seemed to seep into the walls, into the wood, into the very foundation. Aldrich could not breathe. He knew, without knowing how, that what she said was true. The ground itself was remembering. The chanting ceased as abruptly as it began. Latoya turned to Aldrich, her eyes darker than night. "It is time you see what lies beneath." She pointed to the floorboards of the chapel. The ministers shouted prayers, nurses screamed, patients wept. And then, before any could stop her, Latoya knelt, pressed her palm to the wood, and whispered 3 words in her unknown tongue. The boards groaned, cracked, and from the splintering floor beneath the altar, something rose. Not a body, not a ghost. A hand. A skeletal hand, slick with earth, clawing upward into the candlelight. The hand in the chapel. The hand that broke through the chapel floor was not flesh but bone, blackened by soil. Its brittle fingers curled as though still clawing for breath. Nurses shrieked, patients collapsed in prayer, and Reverend Whitmore raised his Bible high, voice breaking in desperate scripture. But Latoya knelt calmly, her palm resting over the skeletal wrist as if steadying it. Her voice poured into the air like water slipping between stones, the strange tongue fluid, unearthly. The hand stilled. "Do not fear," she said softly, her eyes lifting toward Aldrich. "This is not resurrection. It is memory. The earth has simply grown tired of silence." For a moment no one moved. The chapel's air stank of wet soil and iron, as if the grave itself had inhaled into the room. Aldrich forced himself forward, his boots crunching on splintered wood, and stared at the exposed cavity beneath the altar. There were more bones, not one, but dozens. Skulls, femurs, ribs, all jumbled together in a pit that should never have been hidden. The ministers recoiled. Whitmore fell to his knees, his lips mumbling prayers that failed to steady his trembling hands. Reverend Blackwood turned pale as parchment. "This is sacrilege," he whispered. "This is proof of wickedness. You see, she conjures graves to break our faith." But Aldrich shook his head. His voice, though faint, cut through the chaos. "No, she did not create them. They were always here." The Unearthed. Truth by morning, the infirmary was no longer hospital, but excavation site. Boards were pried up, lanterns lowered into cavities, and the truth rose piece by piece. Beneath the foundation lay the remains of not one but 2 burial grounds. The Pennacook, who had once claimed the land, and the unmarked dead of slavery's shadow, runaways, captives, the forgotten. Nurse Thornton wept openly as she pulled fragments of cloth from the soil. "These are children's," she whispered, "small as a doll's dress." Dr. Hartwell could not bear to look. "We treated our patients above them," he muttered, his voice hollow. "For 10 years we slept and prayed and healed atop their suffering." Aldrich's stomach turned as the pit widened. Not only bones. Objects, too, fetters rusted to flakes, beads carved of stone, tokens of rituals never meant to be buried. The grave was not accidental. It was deliberate silencing, centuries deep. Latoya stood at the edge of the excavation, silent, her brass locket glinting faintly in the weak light. "They wanted them forgotten," she said finally, "but memory does not rot like flesh. It waits." The ministers' rage that night, the ministers convened again in Aldrich's office, the bones still echoing in their minds. Whitmore's face was ashen. "This cannot be spoken," he insisted. "If word spreads, Millbrook will be ruined. The church, the hospital, destroyed. Graves of heathens and slaves beneath a Christian house of mercy. No. We bury them deeper. We cover this." Reverend Marsh nodded fiercely. "Seal the pit. Burn her locket. Exorcise her, and let this end." But Blackwood said nothing at first. His eyes darted, haunted. Finally he whispered, "My father knew." He wrote of experiments of patients who spoke with tongues of ancestors. He tried to erase them, but he failed. And now she is here again. He looked directly at Aldrich. She will not be silenced by your science or our prayers. She is not one woman. She is the wound itself. Aldrich leaned forward, his voice cold. If you silence her, you silence the truth. These bones beneath us are not lies. They are history. And she is forcing us to look. Whitmore's hand slammed the table. Then you are as damned as she is. The room erupted. Faith against reason, truth against fear, all crumbling under the weight of what had been unearthed. The plague of dreams, as if the graves had loosed their secrets into the very air, the hospital descended into plague, not of disease but of dreams. Every patient dreamt the same visions: forests burning, ships rolling in storm, children stolen from mothers, whips striking skin. They woke screaming, clutching at their own bodies as if wounds had reopened across centuries. Staff fared no better. Nurse Thornton confessed she dreamt of drowning in chains. Dr. Brennan, fevered with obsession, described entire ceremonies in detail, rituals of fire and chanting, though he had never witnessed them. Reverend Marsh collapsed in prayer, shrieking that the devil walked the infirmary, and Aldrich dreamt of himself as Nehemiah Blackwood, his own hands performing cruel experiments in the cellar. When he awoke, his nails were black with dirt, though he had never touched the soil. In his journal he scrawled, "The past is leaking into us. We are no longer healers. We are carriers of memory." The descent to the cellar Latoya led Aldrich to the hospital's basement, where the damp stone walls wept moisture. She pressed her palm against a hidden door he had never noticed before, its wood warped, hinges rusted shut. "You know what lies here?" she whispered. He swallowed hard. "My predecessor's journals spoke of confinement." Her gaze pierced him. "Not confinement, torture. Your kind called it medicine." The door groaned as it opened, revealing a chamber dark as a tomb. Lantern light spilled onto rusted restraints, leather straps bolted to tables, instruments stained with age. The air was suffocating, thick with iron and rot that clung even after decades. "This," Latoya murmured, her voice low, "is where he tried to break me." Aldrich's stomach churned. He imagined her body bound to these tables, her cries echoing in stone, her memory dissected like flesh. His hands trembled as he traced one instrument, cold and jagged, and then he froze. Carved into the table's wood were words, Latin, English, fragments of the unknown tongue, all etched by desperate hands. A litany of memory, scratched into stone so time could not erase it. "They tried to cut memory out of me," Latoya whispered, "but pain only deepens what cannot die." The hospital's collapse by the 3rd week of February. The infirmary teetered on the brink of collapse. Patients refused to eat unless they were near Latoya. Nurses begged to be reassigned. The ministers prayed without ceasing, their voices hoarse, their faith hollow, and then the walls themselves began to bleed. It was subtle at first, brown stains seeping from cracks, mistaken for water. But when touched, the liquid smelled of copper. The staff recoiled. The patients whispered, "The ground remembers." At night, doors opened on their own. The chapel bells rang, though no hand touched the rope. And in every corner, voices muttered in languages no one alive had learned. The hospital had become not sanctuary but mausoleum, a place where the dead rose not in flesh but in memory, demanding to be heard. The minister's last stand, desperate. Whitmore gathered the other 2 ministers and stormed Latoya's chamber. They dragged her into the chapel, bound her wrists, and placed her at the altar. "In the name of God," Whitmore cried, "we cast out the spirits that inhabit you." The congregation of patients and staff watched in horror as the ministers prayed, shouted, sprinkled holy water that sizzled when it touched her skin. Latoya did not scream. She laughed, a low, sorrowful laugh that echoed like thunder. "You cannot cast out memory," she said. "It is not within me. It is within you." The ground trembled, the lamps shattered, and from the floor of the chapel, dozens of skeletal hands burst upward at once. Patients shrieked, nurses fainted, the ministers dropped their Bibles in terror. The dead had come to bear witness. Amid the chaos, Aldrich staggered forward, his heart pounding, his mind breaking. The skeletons did not rise fully, but their hands, their skulls, their fragments clawed through the floor, surrounding Latoya like an army of witnesses. Her eyes glowed in the dim candlelight as she turned to Aldrich. "It is time," she whispered. "Time to remember what your hands have done." And before he could speak, before he could deny, Aldrich looked down and saw that his own hands were no longer his. They were Nehemiah Blackwood's, slick with blood, holding the scalpel that had once cut into her flesh. The scalpel in his hand, doctor. Jonathan Aldrich stared at his hands and saw not skin, nor flesh, nor the thin veins he had known all his life. He saw Nehemiah Blackwood's hands, veined, pale, bones sharper, nails rimmed with earth. The scalpel in his grip gleamed though he had never lifted it. The chapel around him pulsed with screams, nurses shrieking, patients sobbing, ministers clawing at their Bibles as skeletal hands writhed from the floor. But all of it blurred. Aldrich saw only his hands slick with phantom blood. "No," he whispered. "I am not him." Latoya's voice cut through, calm, merciless. "You are not him, but his memory flows through you. As it flows through this place, you cannot heal what you refuse to claim." He dropped the scalpel, but the echo rang louder than steel should. The walls quivered, the rafters shook, and every crucifix in the room tilted sideways as if shamed. The minister's frenzy Whitmore's face had twisted into something near madness. His prayers no longer sounded holy but shrill, spit-slick syllables spat at Latoya as if the violence of volume might cast her out. "She conjures demons," he shouted. "Bind her, burn her, seal the ground. This is witchcraft revived." "Reverend." Marsh stumbled toward the altar, a crucifix gripped like a weapon. But when he raised it above Latoya, the cross blackened, its silver sizzling as though thrust into fire. He dropped it with a scream. Reverend Blackwood alone remained silent. His father's journals had cracked him wide open. His eyes were fixed on Latoya not with hatred but terror that skirted recognition. "She shows us ourselves," he whispered, almost to no one. "That is why we fear her." The night of voices that night, no one in the infirmary slept. Patients muttered in dozens of tongues, voices overlapping until the corridors sounded like a congregation of the dead. Nurses tried to hush them but failed, for every word spoken carried weight. Names, places, forgotten songs. The boy Timothy spoke in the voice of a long-dead Pennacook elder, describing how the forest had been burned for settlement. Mrs. Hitchcock's vacant bed, now occupied by another patient, seemed to breathe as if the dead widow herself still lingered, whispering her husband's name in the dark. Even the rats had returned, scurrying along the baseboards in patterns that resembled writing. Nurse Thornton swore the droppings they left behind spelled remember. And Aldrich heard his father's voice. His father had died in his boyhood, yet now, in the empty corridors, the man's words rang. "You were meant to heal, Jonathan." But healing requires truth. Do you dare look at it? The experiment of memory-driven half-mad with obsession, Aldrich devised a test. He gathered 3 patients, 2 nurses, and Reverend Blackwood in the chapel. Latoya agreed to stand at the center. "I will not bind her," Aldrich said. "I will not exorcise her. I will listen. We will all listen." He asked each participant to hold an object retrieved from the burial pit. A rusted shackle, a carved bead, a strip of cloth. When Latoya placed her hands on each, the air grew electric. The bead warmed in Nurse Thornton's palm until she dropped it. Reverend Blackwood clutched the shackle and wept, whispering in voices not his own, "Forgive me. Forgive us." And Aldrich, when Latoya handed him the strip of cloth, collapsed to his knees. Visions burst behind his eyes. A woman screamed, torches in the night, chains rattling in a barn. He felt the shiver of lashes across his own back, the hunger of children starved, the terror of being hidden and forgotten. When he came to, he found himself weeping into the cloth, his tears soaking through stains already centuries old. "This is no demon," he said hoarsely. "This is testimony, the collapse of reason, but not all accepted testimony." When word spread among staff that bones, artifacts, and voices had surfaced, panic erupted. Half the nurses demanded reassignment to Boston hospitals. Patients' families arrived, furious that their loved ones were subjected to pagan rituals. The infirmary's board threatened closure, and still the dreams worsened. Entire wards awoke screaming in unison. Men clawed at their own throats as if no air would fill them. Women whispered in voices not their own. The hospital stank of sweat, iron, and burning oil as lanterns sputtered and died nightly. Even the furnaces, once steady, now blazed uncontrollably or froze into silence. Blessed Mercy had become cursed ground. The ministers' revolt on February 18th, Whitmore and Marsh made their move. With a dozen townsfolk armed with axes and torches, they stormed the infirmary by night. "We end this tonight," Whitmore cried. "We burn her and we salt the ground." Patients screamed as men shoved them aside. Nurses barred doors, but the mob broke them open. Aldrich and Reverend Blackwood stood in the corridor, blocking their way. "You'll destroy every soul in this building," Aldrich warned. "She already has," Whitmore spat. His eyes were wide, his Bible gripped like a cudgel. "Better ash than unholy memory." The mob surged forward, and then the chapel bells rang by themselves. A sound so loud, so sudden, it froze the crowd in place. The bells tolled not with the weight of bronze, but with a voice, deep, endless. Remember, 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 the rising. The mob fell to their knees, covering their ears, but Aldrich staggered toward the chapel, pulled by unseen force. Latoya stood at the altar, her arms raised, eyes closed. The skeletal hands that had clawed from the floor now stretched higher, an army of bones reaching toward her like supplicants. The rafters creaked, the windows shattered, the crucifix above. The altar split down the middle. Latoya opened her eyes. They glowed, not with fire but with memory itself, centuries layered behind her pupils. "You built your world upon our silence," she said, her voice carrying like thunder. "Now you will hear." And every person present, mob, minister, nurse, patient, collapsed where they stood, their minds invaded with visions. Aldrich fell last, the ground rushing up to meet him. The night of collective possession, it was no dream. It was no waking, it was both. Every soul in Blessed Mercy shared one vision: the forest burning, ships rolling in storm, chains binding wrists. They saw lives not their own, slaves dying in barns, indigenous elders buried alive, children stolen, mothers beaten, fathers hanged. They screamed with voices not their own. They wept with grief not theirs. For hours, the infirmary became a stage where the dead performed through the living. Every bed, every hallway, every corner shook with stories long buried, and Latoya at the center, her body rigid, her lips moving in languages none had known but all now understood. Remember, remember, remember. The fracture of Aldrich. When Aldrich awoke, he was still on the chapel floor, but the chapel was not the same. The altar dripped with water, though no pipe had burst. The walls bore carvings that had not been there before, names, hundreds of them, etched as if by invisible hands. And inside him, a fracture had opened. Half of him was Aldrich, physician, rationalist, trained by Harvard, bound to science. The other half was Nehemiah Blackwood, cruel experimenter haunted by his own sins. He saw through both eyes, felt through both hands. His throat carried both voices. Latoya stood before him. Her face was sorrowful. "You see now. You carry both healer and oppressor. You must choose which hand you will raise." Behind her, the minister stirred, broken by visions. Whitmore wept blood. Marsh cowered in silence. Reverend Blackwood stared at his own hands as though seeing his father's ghost within them. The choice weighed like chains. Latoya stepped closer. "The dead demand an answer. Will you bury them again? or will you speak what has been silenced?" Aldrich's chest heaved. His fractured mind warred. Then he felt it, the scalpel in his hand again, though he had not touched it. Blackwood's voice whispered through his own mouth, "Cut her. Silence her. End this curse." But Latoya reached out, touched his trembling wrist, and whispered, "Or free them." Aldrich screamed as the two halves of himself split wide, his hand rising on, and no one could yet see whether it would strike to silence or to save. The split the chapel was hushed, though moments earlier it had thundered with screams. The skeletal hands had sunk back beneath the floor, but the earth still breathed as if waiting. The air smelled of wet soil and burning oil, every lungful thick with memory. Dr. Jonathan Aldrich knelt on the stone, his hand shaking, the scalpel gleaming. In one breath he was himself, a physician, a rationalist, a man sworn to heal. In the next, he was Nehemiah Blackwood, the experimenter, the torturer, the man who had tried to silence Latoya years before. His mind fractured, reality bending in two. He could feel the weight of both lives. The patient stared at him with wide, terrified eyes, waiting to see which man would rise. Latoya stood above him, her presence both fragile and eternal. Her brass locket glimmered faintly in the altar's candlelight. "Choose," she whispered. "Choose the healer, or choose the butcher, the minister's ruin." The three ministers lay sprawled around the chapel, broken men. Reverend Whitmore clutched his Bible with bloodied hands, muttering prayers that no longer carried conviction. Reverend Marsh had curled into himself, rocking and humming like a child. Reverend Blackwood trembled, staring at his own palms as though they belonged to his father. "He lives in me," he whispered. "I feel his sins in my veins. How do I stand in this place knowing the blood I carry, Latoya?" Turned to him, her voice cutting but not cruel. "Blood is only vessel, memory is choice. You are not bound to his cruelty unless you refuse to speak it aloud." Her words tore him open. Reverend Blackwood wept openly, his shoulders shaking. For the first time, Aldrich saw in him not minister, not heir to a cursed name, but a broken man wrestling with inheritance. The surge of memory. The chapel walls vibrated, and then it came again. The flood of memory. Not faint whispers this time, but an ocean crashing down. Every patient, nurse, minister, and doctor in the infirmary was seized by visions at once. They saw the burial ground as it had been, elders chanting beneath the trees, bodies lowered into sacred earth. They saw the slave ship Esperanza tossed on black waves, children chained and crying, mothers torn away. They saw the early years of the hospital, when bodies were exhumed and shoved into pits to make way for brick. They saw Nehemiah Blackwood binding Latoya to a table, the scalpel carving into her wrist as she whispered prayers in tongues unknown. The vision swelled until every man and woman felt themselves break, not only as witnesses, but participants. They carried the guilt of their ancestors, the screams of strangers, the weight of bones under their feet. And when the flood receded, silence held. Aldrich's choice. Jonathan Aldrich gasped for breath. His hand trembled with the scalpel still, caught between two fates. He saw himself, two versions, one striking Latoya, ending her, silencing history again, the other lowering the blade, acknowledging her as truth-bearer, freeing her from the burden she carried. Latoya leaned closer, her eyes fathomless. "I cannot force you. The dead will not force you. Memory only asks, will you deny us, or will you carry us forward?" Aldrich dropped the scalpel. It clattered on stone and slid into shadow. His shoulders heaved, his voice cracked. "No more silence," he said. "Not again." Latoya smiled, not triumphant but weary, as though she had waited lifetimes for those words. The awakening of the hospital. The chapel shook with a sound like 100 sighs released at once. The air grew warmer. The bleeding walls dried. The skeletal hands withdrew fully, the soil smoothing as if no grave had ever been disturbed. Patients who had been fevered with madness fell still. Nurses who had dreamt horrors found their eyes clear. Even Whitmore's trembling ceased, his Bible slipping from his grip as he slumped to the floor. The hospital exhaled, and in that moment, Blessed Mercy Infirmary felt like its name for the first time. Latoya's departure. The days after blurred like a fever breaking. The staff whispered of miracles, patients recovering, fevers vanishing, wounds knitting. Reverend Marsh disappeared into the countryside, never to return. Reverend Whitmore resigned, his sermons hollow thereafter. Reverend Blackwood remained, but humbled, devoting his life to mending families torn by grief. And Latoya? On the morning of February 28th, she came to Aldrich's office. Her white dress was plain, her brass locket still around her neck. "My work here is finished," she said. Aldrich rose, desperate. "Where will you go? Who will help you carry this?" Her eyes softened. "Others will. You are one of them now. You chose the healer. That is enough." She pressed the locket into his hand. When he opened it, instead of soil, he saw dust that glowed faintly. Ash. Memory. Earth from graves. "Keep it," she whispered. "As long as it remains in this house, the truth cannot be buried again." And then, like morning fog dissipating, she was gone. No one saw her leave. Her room was empty. Her presence vanished. The years after, Blessed Mercy changed. Aldrich rewrote its mission, shaping treatment not only for body but for mind and soul. Patients spoke openly of grief, of ancestral burdens. The memorial garden was planted over the excavation site, stones etched with names spoken during the higher visions. For decades, the hospital thrived. Aldrich became known not just as physician, but as pioneer of what future generations would call holistic medicine. But privately, he kept his journals, records of Latoya, of the bones, of the night, the dead rose. He knew the world was not ready for such testimony. He locked the journals away in his attic, where they would remain hidden for more than a century. The final twist in 1877, 30 years later, Aldrich, older, slower, received a letter from Ohio. A colleague described a patient, a young woman, olive-skinned, dark-haired, appearing no older than 22, though she claimed to remember centuries. She spoke in tongues unknown. She healed through memory. The letter named her Latoya. Aldrich's pen slipped from his hand. He thought of the locket, still in the chapel altar, pulsing faintly when the candles burned low. He thought of her words, "You will see me again in every place where the dead need to speak." He realized then what he had chosen, not only to free her but to release something larger, an eternal witness. The park today, the Blessed Mercy Infirmary, was demolished in 1923. A park sits there now. Children play, lovers walk, joggers pass. Most know nothing of the bones, the visions, the young woman named Latoya, but some visitors swear the air feels different. A peace hums beneath the soil. And sometimes, if one lingers near the park's oldest oak, a voice whispers in languages no one can place. Not threatening, not angry, just insistent. Remember. Closing beat. The case of Latoya remains one of the most disturbing and mysterious episodes in American medical history. A story so terrifying that physicians burned their records, ministers fled their pulpits, and only fragments of truth survived. Was she a woman burdened by trauma, a vessel of ancestral memory, or something more, something eternal, sent to remind us that silence is the deadliest disease? The truth lies buried with her. Or perhaps not buried at all. Perhaps it waits, under every hospital, under every church, under every place where bones lie restless. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough, in the silence of night you too will hear her whisper, "Remember,